All right, we are going to talk about integers. We're going to compare order, talk about opposites, and absolute value. The second page of every notes page will tell you the standards we're learning in 7th grade math, and then it will also tell you your goal for the day. So our goal today is to be able to determine absolute value, opposites of integers, and then also be able to compare them. The third slide is always going to include fluency work. Fluency work is just work with numbers. So in this particular slide, I want you to choose any number. So I'm going to choose my favorite number, which is 24. And then in step 2, it asks you to write the numbers opposite down. So the opposite of any number, if it's positive, it becomes negative. Or if you wrote a negative number down, it becomes positive. Then step number 3 is to write its absolute value down. So if you're not familiar with absolute value or can't remember it from last year, absolute value looks like football goalposts. We put the negative or positive number in it, and it's distance from 0. So distance from 0 is always a positive value, so this is going to come out with a final number of 24. Moving on to the next slide, I always include some type of problem solving or critical thinking. So in this particular one, I'm going to highlight as I go through and find all the things that I need to solve the problem. Employees were looking at their debts. Well, debts might be an important word because we need to know that debts means a negative type of value. Gomez is in $143 worth of debt. Cole has $203 worth of debt. And Ford has $178 worth of debt. Simpson has a positive bank balance. So this is important because we've just talked about debt and now we're talking about positives. So Simpson has a positive bank balance of $350 and we want to find out who owes the most money. So I'm going to take all of my values and I'm going to write them down below. So I have a negative 143 because that's talking about debt, a negative 203, a negative 178, and then we know Simpson, he's positive, so he has a positive 350. So if we're talking about who owes the most money, we know it can't be Simpson because if you have a positive value, you're not owing any money. Then we want to think what number is closest to 0. That has to be crossed off next. So that would be negative 143. The next closest would be negative 178, and that leaves us with $203 owed, which is the most money owed, which is Cole. And that's it for our problem solving and critical thinking. I'm going to go on to our lesson notes. So lesson notes are divided into I do's, we do's, and you do's. In this particular lesson, since I'm not there, I started with the I do's so I can show you exactly what I want you to do in your practice problems. So there's going to be 3 slides that I'm going to continuously go through, and then I'm going to take a pause and I'm going to explain what you're going to do next. So we're going to go through these 2 definitions first. So I have absolute values and opposites, which you should have already written down in your math binder. Absolute value is the integer's distance from 0 on the number line. This value is always positive. So keep in mind, you should be filling these in as I'm showing them on the screen. The next thing is opposites. Integers that are the equal distance from 0 on the number line are considered opposites. So I'm talking for negative 4 or 1 and negative 1. 0 cannot be an opposite by itself because it's directly in the center of the number line. Now we're going to practice writing some integers from descriptions. The first 2 are 5 degrees below 0. So if I'm talking about below, I know that's got to be a negative value, and then I just put the 5 on it. If I'm talking about a loss of 12 yards, that's also a negative value, and attach the 12. That's your first I do slide, so it's like the learning slide. We're going to move on to the second one. The second one, we're going to zoom in and we're going to talk about graphing and finding opposites. So if I start with a negative number, I have to find its opposite, which is a positive value. So this is 7. Then I'm going to use my highlight tool and I'm going to graph the 2 opposites, negative and positive 7. Then I'm going to go to my next number line. If I start with a positive value, I know that an opposite is a negative. And again, I'm going to highlight negative 12 and positive 12. As you can see, this number line didn't go out that far, so I would want to make sure that I note where negative 12 is and where positive 12 is, since those are the two values I'm asked to graph. Graphing on a number line requires you to actually put the dot on the number line, not above and not below. Next, we're going to take a look at some absolute values. So these three are all a little different. The first one starts with a negative 3 in the absolute value. All we're doing is finding its distance from 0. So the distance from 0 of negative 3 is 3. Remember, these values are always positive. This one happens to be a little different, and this one looks similar. They're different because you have to do an operation in between doing the absolute value and actually finding it. So you can't tell me the absolute value of 7 and 8 separately. You have to solve negative 7 plus 8. So if I have more positive, that leaves me with 1. I keep the goalpost or the absolute value around it, and then I say my final answer is positive 1, or the distance from 0. 10 minus 11. Well, if I'm taking away more than I have, that's going to leave me with a negative 1. And then the absolute value of that is 1. And there's your second slide for integers. Your third slide, scrolling to right now, is going to talk about writing numbers from least to greatest and comparing. So we're going to zoom in here. When you write these numbers from least to greatest, consider your negatives first. So I have 2 of those. I accidentally covered that up, so let me try again. The one that's furthest from 0 is always our smallest number. So that's negative 8. And then all we're left with is positive 4. I'm going to grab my highlight tool, and I'm going to quickly put dots at negative 8, negative 5, and positive 4, making sure to follow all those directions. The last part is comparing. Comparing is going to use these symbols, and hopefully we remember them from last year. They're less than, greater than, or equal to. When I have a comparison of a positive and a negative, I always know my positive is bigger, no matter what. And when I'm comparing 2 of the same sign, I have to consider on the positive side which one's furthest from 0. In this case, it's 5, and that's my bigger number. So now we've gone through each of the 3 learning slides, and I'm going to ask you to pause the video, and you're going to do the next 2 slides with a partner. So you're going to do this we do slide and the next we do slide, and then you're going to come back once the whole class has finished them. Typically, when I'm there, we do 1 slide at a time. So go ahead and pause the video and try both of these slides with a partner. All right, now that you've come back to this slide, let's talk about the answers. So writing an integer, if we know we're above sea level, we're going to have a positive value. You can write the positive sign, but there's no need. You can just write a 2,000. If I'm talking about a debt, I know I'm talking about a negative value, and that's negative 7. Moving along to the absolute values, remember anything within absolute values, those absolute value signs are acting like parentheses. So I'm going to solve first and say negative 7 plus 8 gives me positive 1, and then the absolute value of that is 1. This one is a little different because those absolute values aren't around both the negative 5 and 4. So I'm going to take my absolute value of negative 5 first, which is positive 5, and I'm going to add my 4 to it to get a final answer of 9. On the other side of this slide, it was asking you to find the opposite and graph. So the opposite you should have written down is positive 6, and then your graph should have had 2 dots at positive 6 and negative 6. Take a look and make sure you have all 5 of these answers correct. Now we're going to scroll down to our other we do slide. The first one asks you to put the numbers in order least to greatest. So again, I'm going to consider my negative numbers first, which there's only 1. Then my positives. 0 should be directly between negative 9 and positive 9, which would lead us to believe that we have opposite values in between or on the outside of 0. And last, we have the comparing. In this, we're comparing two negative numbers. Remember, when you compare negatives, the closer to 0, the bigger it is. So if -2 is closer, it is the bigger number and the arrow is open towards it. In 7 versus the absolute value of 9, I have to find the absolute value of 9 first, which is 9, and then throw in my comparison symbol. So there's your we do slide, the second one. Now I'm going to ask that you guys pause the video one more time, and on this next slide, you're going to try all these problems independently by yourself. When you're done, finished as a class, you can put the video back on and check your work. So now that you've completed these 5 problems, let's go over them together. Find the absolute value. So the 6 and the 3 are enclosed by absolute values. So I'm going to solve first and get 9. And then when I take the absolute value of that, I get positive 9 again. The next one, I have 12 minus 11, which is 1. And the absolute value of that is 1. Graph and find the opposite. This one includes an absolute value. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to take the absolute value of -7, which is 7. And then I'm also going to write its opposite down, which is -7. And then I'm going to graph both. And then the last set of problems asks you to compare using the symbols again. Remember, anytime you have an absolute value listed, you have to solve the absolute value first, then compare the two numbers. So in this case, 7 is greater than 0. And then last, you have 4 and positive 5, and 5 is greater than 4. If you forgot to take the absolute value of this first, you might have your arrow flipped, in which case it's wrong because you need to do the absolute value first. So here's your you do slide. If you need to review this video, all you need to do is put your earbuds in, click, and you can watch it again before you do your classwork.